Hey everyone, Marc and Trevor here again. We're into week 3 and we're touching on purpose. You were formed for God's family. And, family is beautiful when it's working right. Let's just be honest. But when it's not working well, it can be a horrible place to be in, an environment to be in. And I think even in this time, when you look back at people's lives, you often, I know for myself, I'm quite undone when I hear people's tragic stories in families, broken families. We live in a society where family isn't celebrated to the point where it should be. The wholeness of family, the purity of family, and the love and the security of what family brings. And so I thought, hey, why don't we start out? Trev, talk a little bit about your family. That would be a good thing.
Okay, impromptu now.
Yeah, maybe.
This is what we're doing, okay.
So tell us just who are you? Where do you come from? Most of us don't know.
So I actually grew up in Pretoria.
Yeah.
Got an older sister and a younger brother, and was not a very good sibling for the first part of my life.
Middle child.
Middle child. Jesus had to do a proper work in me. Grew up in an incredible family. I think had a mom and dad that really loved Jesus, and there was a legacy of our grandparents and grandparents following Jesus and loving Jesus, which was amazing. Grew up for a large part of my younger childhood on a plot, which I know is not a farm like you guys.
Oh, wait, it's fun. It's nearly there.
Dude, we had little chickens, we had ducks. It was it was a vibe.
Okay, good.
It was great. But I think even in growing up, realized that even though I had a great family, I still had some big insecurities around my identity. And I think that's part of what we're going to be looking at is just how family also helps shape our identity.
Yeah.
And then, went off to high school, went off to varsity, and it was, like I mentioned 2 episodes ago, it was really after varsity that this started really grabbing my heart. It's a bit about my family. What about you?
My family, yeah. I've got a older brother, and we grew up on a farm, proper farm. Not at all.
We used to eat your pets.
It was predominantly sugarcane up the north coast, so we did have some cattle and stuff. But and again, life was really just all we knew it. I think when you grow up as a kid, this is all that you know, and only when you look back and you realize, wow, the privilege that you get to live in. And so I really just my parents were amazing. They got saved just before I was born. My brother had really been born at the time. And it just so honoring in that space that we got to experience something of their pursuing of Christ. They were passionate for Jesus, and they still are. They just still are such an incredible role model to us. And as they were running after God and loving after God, we got swept up in this incredible adventure of serving Jesus. And I think for me, it's just beautiful because I'm sure like you, Trev, as a father, it's that there were certain things that your parents had to learn along the way, which you don't have to learn. Yeah. You learn from them and you're able to implement something that's totally different, a different strategy, which I think is so beautiful about family. It's like this ascending, as something good is experienced, then we learn from it and we implement those new cultures and those new rhythms and those new ways. And that's the beauty of family. Family is just powerful. And I don't know how you live life. I don't know how you exist outside of family, to be honest, but that's my experience. And I'm sure there are many people watching that might not have that experience and have had a warped or broken or unfortunate space. I think even if I think of people losing parents, at key moments of their lives or people walking out on them and all the things that people have to deal with. And I think part of what Rick is trying to help us with is highlighting again the importance of contending, I think that's the right word, for this thing of family.
And I think what you mentioned there is so key, that God's picture of community has always been family, and our belonging to a family, in a family. And because of that, the devil's strategy is always to isolate. Yeah. It's always to cause offense. It's always to get people to walk by themselves. And it's interesting that the first purpose was that you were planned for God's pleasure, but now the second purpose is you're formed for family. And exactly that point of people, no matter what your circumstance or what life has thrown you to date, realizing that you can find a sense of belonging in God's family. Yeah. One of the things which I love about our church environment is that there's a process of becoming, which is to belong, then to believe, then to behave, then to become. And I think that's something that Rick Warren also elaborates on. He says, first importance is you actually belonging before you begin believing, which is really cool.
It is powerful. And the story that sort of resonates with me as you're speaking is the prodigal son. Yeah. I think there's this young man who is part of, I would assume, a very loving environment, a wealthy environment, a happening environment, has a future remaining in the family, but yet chooses to isolate himself. And that's such a key word. It's like isolation. And he went with everything that he thought was important to him. An inheritance, his independence, everything that, in a sense, our culture perpetuates. It says, actually, you must become something of that. You need to become something of that. And so he leaves his house, the dwelling, the place that he knew so well, to, in a sense, stretch his wings a bit, but finds himself at a dead end. And I love the picture of that because it didn't matter how far. It doesn't say how far he was, like what city he was, if he was like 100 k's away or where he was. But yet him realizing in that place that actually he's a son. Yeah. That's the beauty about family. It's like realizing who you are. It's that identity thing that we started off with. And he turns around and he comes back. And if you know the story so well, the father meets him along the way, welcomes him, loves him, brings him in, and there's this massive celebration because the son has returned. And I think that for me, if there was ever a sweet moment of the redemptive work that God so desires to see take place in the world, is seeing the isolated, the rejected, the persecuted, those who have been shunned by society even, those who have been removed out of a place of security, come back home. Yeah. And I know even as you arrive in the parking lot of our church at NCCB, on the wall is welcome home. And so many people have felt like that has been such a prophetic statement because it's like they have firstly been welcomed, but not just to any environment, into a place of belonging, which is the home environment. You know?
Yeah. I think what I really like about this is he makes it practical as well. He makes 3 statements when talking about understanding what matters most. And he says, the best use of life is love. The best expression of love is time. And the best time to love is now. And I think in those 3 statements, so much is unpacked of what we've been talking about, that in this life, we've been created to be loved by God and to express love to God and others. And the only way that can happen is if we actually take time to do it. And there's no time like the present. Yeah. And I think if you look at the world that we live in, it is constantly just getting busier and busier and busier. And people are living such hurried lives that they barely have time to not only be loved, but to love others. And I think this week really starts challenging people on where in your life is margin for you to actually be loved and be a part of a family, which takes time and takes effort, but then in turn to also love others.
Yeah. And again, Galatians 5 verse 14 in that is like, who do we love? You know what I mean? So, the biggest command that is said here is the entire law. So of all the laws, the entire law is summed up in a single command. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's like, well, who is my neighbor? And we live in a society which often we don't even know who our neighbors are because we've got these massive walls around our properties to try and keep people out. But yet actually the most important thing for us to do is to love who? Or the people that are closest to us, but yet the people that are so far away from us.
What I love about what you said there as well is that Galatians 5 verse 14, Paul actually summarizes Jesus' summary. Yeah. So in Matthew 22, when one of the lawyers asked Jesus, like, what's the greatest command of all of the law? There are over 600 commandments in the Torah. And Jesus says it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all the soul, with all your strength. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. What Paul then does is he takes it from 2 that Jesus summarized, and he takes it down to 1, and he says to love others as you love yourself, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And it's so interesting to me that when Jesus said it, he was like, love God and then love others as yourself. And Paul was in essence saying, it's still easy to love God.
Yeah.
You know, God's perfect. He's not imperfect. Like, you can love him, but what is really hard and what will really demonstrate that you're living out this greatest command is if you can love others as yourself. Yeah. Because unless you're loving God, you're never going to be able to love others. Yeah. So it's interesting that you say that, yeah.
Yeah, and so that neighbor can be a taxi driver who's neighboring me in my vehicle. You know, it's not necessarily, in a sense, my address, but it's going to the shop and standing in a queue. There's neighbors all around. There are people. Neighbor means, in the sense, that the person that is nearest to you, that is living nearest to you. And so that for me is something that, like, how am I doing in that? Like, I think for me, it's easy to love the people that are lovable. Well, what are the people that are not lovable? You know? And so I think that whole thing for me has been such a big thing, because actually, as Rick Warren says, love means giving up, yielding my preference. Oh, so do we have preferences? Yes, we do. We have preferences, you know what I mean? It's like actually yielding my preference. Mark, you have to talk to your preference. You have to realize that as you're confronted with your neighbor, that his or her preference isn't your preference, and now who's going to be the first one to lay down their preference? Me. I must lay down yield my preference, my comforts, my goals, my security, my money, energy, or time for the benefit of someone else. Yeah. That's massive, Trev. Like if that could sink in, like for the benefit of others. If we live just purely for the benefit of others, it's, as I say, it's easy for our family. I live for the benefit of my kids. But for my neighbor, wow.
I think, and again, you touch on something so key. So often when you ask people what the purpose of their life is, they default to what they do, not how they do whatever they do. Yeah. And I think one of the things that Rick Warren does really well is he quotes Mother Teresa, and she says, it's not what you do, but how much love you put into it that matters. Mm. And I think so often we get caught up in grappling with our purpose, and if I'm not doing this, or if I'm not, in my dream job, or if I'm not using all my abilities, then I'm not living purposefully. But what Rick Warren says is like, no, firstly, start with worshiping God. Yeah. Secondly, work on loving people. And in those two things, you're fulfilling the 2 greatest commands, so which is hugely meaningful.
That's so true. Do you think he planned it that way? You just said a good thing there. I'm like,
He's a smart guy.
Yeah, no, maybe he did.
I think he did.
But I think just looking at day 20, he tackles something which I think is so key, and he speaks about restoring broken relationships, or fellowship in a sense. Romans 12 is a portion of scripture, says, do everything possible on your part to live in peace with everybody. It's interesting because I think, it feels like if we can leave brokenness one side, if we can leave like unforgiveness one side, and if we can sort of turn our backs on it and pretend it doesn't exist, that we're actually fooling ourselves to believe that life's okay. And so he touches on this, and he says, actually do everything possible, Romans speaks about. And I think there's a lot of everything possible moments that need to be created in our lives to be able to sit and go, I have rejected this, I have pushed it one side, I have chosen not to respond, but today I'm going to do everything possible to pick up the phone, to desire that brokenness to become whole again. Yeah. Phoning your dad, not your dad, but I'm just saying, I don't know, people with broken relationships, picking up, phoning mom, phoning dad, phoning brother, sister, cousin, friend, and saying, for too long, we've allowed this to be something that has caused a wedge. It's like we're not even neighbors anymore. Yeah. It's like we are enemies. You know what I mean? It's like, actually, how do we bring that back to, that's where it really matters most, fellowship together.
Yeah. I love what he says, that relationships are always worth restoring. Yeah. And what you've described there, I mean, this is going to be touching sore points for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because we spoke around how the devil's idea is to try and isolate people. And the best way of isolating people out of relationship is offense.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
And I love an illustration a friend once showed me. And he said, if you imagine like my hand is a doorpost and my right hand is the door, this door is shut. And he's like, okay, open the door. This door is open.
Yeah.
And then he did the door slightly ajar. And he asked me, is this door open or closed? Open or shut? And even though it's slightly ajar, it's still open. Yeah. And I think sometimes when we think of offense or think of relationships, we're like, no, if we really hate someone and we want to kill them, like the door's open. And if we just have an offense with them or we don't want to talk to them or we haven't dealt with things, the door's mostly closed. But the fact of the matter is it's still open. And as long as our heart is open to offense, we give the devil an opportunity to wreak havoc in our lives. Yeah. And I love like what he says. He gives some really practical pointers. He says, when you're talking broken relationships, sometimes we need to avoid conflict, sometimes we need to create conflict, and sometimes we need to resolve conflict. And he gives these 7 practical points on how do you go about actually resolving conflict. And interestingly, the starting point is he says, talk to God before talking to the person. Yeah. And I just love that. It's like so often we want to rush in and we want to talk to other people or we want to confront the person in a heated moment. And he's like, no. Like the first person you should be talking to God. And when you talk to God about the person, ask God to give you his perspective of them. And then once you've got that perspective, then go and take initiative. But until you've spoken to God about the person, don't talk to anyone else about them and don't go talk to them.
Yeah, it's so good. And I think for me, it's coming again and going, fellowship for me is something that, as you said, Rick said, it's worth it. It's worth fighting for. But it's like in some ways, some people see it as two different worlds. You've got sort of my world of experience outside of local church and my world within local church, And so, it sounds like sometimes people have better relationships outside of local church because they're dealing with offense in local church. And then sometimes it's the other way around. I don't think we can prefer one or the other. At the end of the day, we need to live in both worlds, both camps. If you even create 2 worlds in your mind, at the end of the day, you shouldn't. But if you do, it's like sitting and going, you know what? I need to be a person that I can look at a brother, anyone. If you're going into the supermarket and you see someone going down the aisle and you feel like you have to go to the next aisle to avoid that person, there's some challenges. Yeah. You need to deal with some. It doesn't matter which world this person comes from. Yeah. We need to be living above this norm of just saying, if we hate it, it's okay. We hate that person. No. We need restoration of fellowship and we need to fight for it. And it requires intentionality. It requires a persistency. And I know for myself and Meg, often it's sitting and asking the question before we go to bed at night, can we go to bed tonight knowing that there is no one out there that we know of, that we have not tried our best to bring that restoration of broken fellowship. And so at least there's a certainty in our hearts to be able to sit and go, we've done everything and we are confident to know that actually we can sleep well tonight. Yeah. And I think that for me is massive for unity. God says, where does he command his blessing? Where there's unity. And it's like, actually, how are we doing with that unity? In the life of local church, in the life of community, in the life of loving my neighbor, is there unity for the blessing of God to be commanded?
Yeah, I think it's so important. And you can't box relationships. It is about unity. I mean, we've had friends where they say, no, rather don't work with family because you want to keep family and work separate. Or on our campus, we've got a school and a church, and people not want to bring kids to the school because they're at the church and they don't want, to muddy the water. And it's so interesting because if we're living according to godly principles, it shouldn't matter whether we're working with family or not working with family. It shouldn't matter, whether we're on a campus where kids are in school and we're in church, because the Bible gives clear guidelines on how we need to be working through things. And often other people's imperfections actually reveal something of an unlikeness of God in me that I have to deal with. And so often when there is conflict, God so often uses conflict to reveal to us situations in our life where we are not yet looking like Him. So really just a great topic.
It is a great topic. Reconciliation, focus on the relationship, while resolution focuses on the problem. And I think that often we live in a culture where let's resolve the problem. No, don't focus on that. We need reconciliation, as in actually there is a focus on the relationship. We need to preserve this. This can change. The problem can come and go, but actually relationships, these are eternal. And we need to preserve it. So what would you say, just quick snapshot, just as we end this time, just on this that we've just touched on?
I think what's so important is that people need to find a place to belong. And local church has been designed as that place. I love what Rick Warren talks about. He talks about the difference of being a church attender and a church member. And he says the difference lies in commitment. And so being committed to a body, being committed to a family, that's what it's all about. Really great topic. I'm looking forward to our episode 4. In episode 4, we're going to be touching on the third purpose, which is you were created to become like Christ. Really an exciting topic, and we look forward to you joining us for that one as well. Thank you.